Hello, my name is Caitlin Berrigan. From 1981 to 2015, I lived chronically infected with a virus. A friend once joked that he wished he could be infected with the hepatitis C virus because clearly its threat on my life was doing something that protected me from aging. I liked this joke, especially because I was not expected to live long enough to age. And I was full of rage. As artist and AIDS activist David Wojnarowicz said, quote, "I'm carrying this rage like a blood-filled egg," unquote. From 2006 to 2010, my early works addressed viruses, spatial choreographies of contagion, medicine, and care. I will share these in the slides without commenting on them. Life cycle of a common weed, viral confections, traces, transfers. They were eggs to contain my rage. They were leaky containers, obviously. They leaked and they haunted, made messes and embarrassments. But to everyone's surprise, including my own, I did not die. Here I am, living this long. The story is long, our time is short. Time as in no linear fucking time. Long as in long haul. Story as in the queer, the crip, and the candlestick. Look closer, you might see that this is not a waxing romantic candlestick that kindles the glow of a cocktail party talking politely about multi-species living together harmoniously on this delicate planet. No, this is a stick of dynamite ready to become airborne. And who will receive its blast? I have some ideas if you will hear me out. To pop off, to become airborne. Air as in atmospheres of the undead, living with viruses, loneliness, and neoliberalism. This is the title of an auto-theoretical essay that narrates how living with a virus reveals the structural inequalities of profit-oriented biomedicine, anticipating the long-term endemic effects of COVID-19 upon global medical priorities. The essay was published in September 2020, several months prior to the release of COVID vaccines, in anticipation of exactly what we have seen. The primary vaccine producers gained delirious billions of dollars from public money, while global leaders of developed nations refused to override patents or change policy to enable life-saving vaccine equity, driving the most impressive force of mass death from a virus ever seen, and widening the chasm of racialized global health disparities. If I can summarize for you the essay, it is this. In the context of medicine and care, there are limits to mutual aid. The state is designed to function as mutual aid. Both mutual aid and the state are romantic concepts. We need to stop being romantics and end patents and the privatization of biomedicine. I will read for you an abridged version of this text. A virus is an undead vector that traces both the beauty and abuses of our mutual reliance. The porosity of our bodies is the very interface of our social being. Porosity affirms that we are already multiple, interdependent, and entangled. A virus is not a metaphor. Different viruses trace divergent choreographies of vulnerability, sociality, and capital markets. Their movements within our social and material lives can draw attention to critical nodes. One of these nodes is where notions of care and cure intersect, yet they must not be conflated. A biomedical cure for a virus depends upon, but is not the same as, the infrastructures of caretaking required to support complex needs for public health such as food, shelter, bodily autonomy, and mental health. Another critical node is where mystification and lack of open participation in decisions about pricing policies for publicly funded biomedical innovation enables the enduring power of pharmaceutical companies to prioritize profit over people's lives in the face of public health crises. Viruses are instrumentalized as vectors of ideology and biopower. The attentions I cultivated towards choreographies of risk and responsibility are again relevant to the present moment, as well as the contours I traced around the black boxed edges of the financialized global health sector. I will intertwine these viral narratives for you here as they direct our attentions to the invisible gaps between us, where we know material interactions are occurring, but we have poorly developed senses to perceive them. Living together with a virus is a lonely way of being. As my peers individuated from dependent adolescence into adulthood, my coming of age was not as a singular human subject. I was already multiple, a human carrying an alien viral load. My subjectivity was shaped by an awareness of having been seeded and colonized by an undead thing, an endless genetic proliferation with no known purpose other than to repeat itself in me and possibly to use me as a vector of infection. From the time of my medical diagnosis at the age of 17, this multiplied subjectivity paradoxically rendered me ever more singular, as the contagious effects of social stigma isolated me from other human beings. First, as an abject body to be feared. Second, as a suspected user of intravenous drugs. And third, as an outlier, both an anomaly within the typical demographics of the diseased and a chronically ill outlier among my carefree friends. As we followed the North American middle-class rites of passage from high school into college, I was excluded from my peers' deliverance of their bodies to each other during substance-altered states of sex and social bonding. The ecstatic self-destruction of these rituals would, I was warned, most certainly destroy my already overburdened liver within a few short years and necessitate a liver transplant. Instead, I delivered my young body to the vast medical apparatuses of international health insurances, clinical trials, alternative therapies, and theories of harm reduction and self-care. I had no one with whom to share my experience of this particular virus with a bland and confusing name. It emerged slowly upon the scene of public health in the 1970s, categorized as a liver disease called non-A, non-B viral hepatitis. When properly identified in 1989, the virus gained its own letter, hepatitis C, HCV. With a slow but deadly disease progression, the hepatitis C virus has made itself hyper-endemic within the human population without ever making a lasting impression on the social imaginary. HCV affects over 71 million people, second to hepatitis B as the most widespread chronic viral illness worldwide, and kills a loose 500,000 people each year. HCV affects disparate demographics of already socially marginalized people with intravenous drug dependency, the poor, people in need of mental health care, first responders, war veterans, and prisoners. Although the majority of people in the U.S. with HCV are white, as am I, prevalence is highest among indigenous North Americans and 3 to 5 times higher among Black and Latinx men. This incidence does not correlate to higher rates of drug use, but rather to the racial injustices of mass incarceration and the criminalization of poverty that makes prison itself a vector of infection. The absence of a universal legal right to health care in the U.S. makes it challenging for the incarcerated to gain treatment. Without the existing bonds of community, no cohesive biosociality emerged, a term conceived by Paul Rabinow to describe a biomedically driven bond within stronger axes of shared identification that propels effective advocacy. It was hard for me to understand feeling isolated despite millions of people out there like me. Over time, I became aware that my loneliness was symptomatic of the permeations of neoliberal ideology within the broad and contested concepts of health and care. One ethical ideological notion of public health is as a common good that benefits everyone. When people are able to access the care they desire, they have greater capacity to actively participate in their lives and connect with others. The ability of the body to labor is of critical concern to politics. Taking measures to treat people with destructive contagious diseases prevents them from spreading. The multiplicity of interdependent bodies within this notion of public health contradicts how neoliberal ideology has shaped it into a transactional relationship between an individual consumer and a commodified health system that, for those in a position of access, extracts profit in exchange for life. As Angela Davis says, quote, "Neoliberal logic assumes that the fundamental unit of society is the abstract individual," unquote, while simultaneously enacting en masse what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called the, quote, "organized abandonment," unquote, of vulnerable communities from social structures. In other words, neoliberal biopolitics amplify and multiply the loneliness of wellness. Gradients of vulnerability to the effects of disease fade into the horizon of neoliberal subjectivation as they become individual responsibilities rather than mutual concerns of the common good. A sharpened awareness of leaking accompanied the formation of my sense of self. The hepatitis C virus courses through the blood, but is not found in other bodily fluids. I followed the material movements of blood with fascination. Each time my skin opened and released a vital stain of iron, protein, and virus, I covered the wound with hypervigilance and let no bloody flake of a booger escape biosafe disposal. I developed a sensory attention to where I deposited and picked up residues at all times. I adapted to view the world as a sea of particulate interactions. Cultivating attentive responsibility towards overwhelming biotic details has returned with coronavirus, and it has proliferated. We are not just leaky vessels that drop fluids onto surfaces. We have become atmospheres. The clouds of others press upon us in awkward choreographies. I strap on a mask in an effort to contain my breath, but the gentle gas escapes through the relaxed edge of fabric on my humidified cheeks. Multiple again, I am a particulate cloud, an assemblage, an unknown quantity as I move through the streets. Living co-inhabited with a virus for 34 years has taught me that survivance is negotiation, not warfare. There is no invisible enemy, and militarized battle rhetoric is meaningless against a virus. Vulnerability is the condition of being in a body, and eliminating the risks of contagion are impossible. We must cultivate the language to favor some things and reject others without abstraction or xenophobia. With the majority of the global population living with chronic conditions, illness is not temporary. The durational struggle lies in fostering collective mutualities of care, both interpersonally within our communities and formally across the health infrastructures of international and state institutions, including shared power structures for biomedical cures. Conventional pharmacological medicine cannot care for all health conditions, but when it can, we want it. It is ours. No matter how robust our networks of care, survivance of viruses puts us in negotiation with the pharmaceutical industry. Drug pricing is unregulated and requires no financial transparency. New legislation will be necessary to empower the government to negotiate the price of prescription drugs. Because the U.S. pays an average of 40% more for the list price of prescription drugs over other high-income nations, what happens with health insurance and drug pricing policy in the U.S. influences pricing strategies for the global market. This inflation does not, however, subsidize research and development or access for low-income countries, but instead results in overall increased profit margins for corporations. This consistent practice of monopolization through patents and pricing biomedicines for what the market can bear anticipates grave global disparities in access to vaccines and treatments for coronavirus. Like the cumulative effects of liver inflammation, HCV profoundly shaped the direction of my life over time. Massachusetts became my home for a period of years because it was the only state in the nation with universal health care. I reoriented towards a profession with a flexible schedule because I could never have expectations of when my body would perform and when it would refuse. Completion upon an able-bodied agenda was a lightly held aspiration. Unquantifiable accretions of hours elided into cycling through medical facilities, being probed and measured, waiting, resting, accepting. What we are collectively experiencing now as pandemic time, those with chronic illness and disabilities know intimately as crypt time, lagging, letting go. Except that crypt time is durational over a lifetime. I grew older than the 20 to 30 years it can take to develop life-threatening cirrhosis. Compounding health conditions such as HIV can accelerate inflammation. I witnessed several activist acquaintances die despite having had HCV longer than they did. I decided it was a waste of energy to think about my death unless presented with evidence of its imminence. But at 25 years old, I began exhibiting tumor markers indicating hepatocellular carcinoma, a deadly form of liver cancer that is survived only with a full liver transplant. Even then, the survival odds are just 5 to 10%, and due to the liver shortages, I would not be a candidate. Death became more proximate, and I was closely monitored for tumors thereafter. While my doctors also kept me in the loop of hopeful studies for new treatments, always on the horizon, the genetic sequence of HCV was patented in 1993 upon identification, stifling research for 2 decades until the Supreme Court finally overturned an existing gene patent in 2013, ruling that naturally occurring genetic sequences are not novel enough for innovations for patents. With research stalled for 2 decades due in part to the gene patent of the viral sequence and meaningful non-prescription treatments and out-of-pocket expense, the care of a disease that affected so many millions of people was effectively abandoned to each individual's capacity and income. Information pamphlets in doctors' offices advised patients to avoid alcohol and drink lots of water, and encouraged us to join overwhelmingly white support groups in the lineage of Alcoholics Anonymous, a forum styled after Christianity to foster group identity around the locus of a shared wound. Left alone to contend with the millions of viruses replicating in my bloodstream, I performed this loneliness in a work called Life Cycle of a Common Weed. I became certified in phlebotomy to draw my own infected blood and used it to fertilize dandelions, which are an herbal treatment for liver and kidney disease. The dandelions enjoy rich nitrogen blood found in blood, and not being human, they remain unaffected by the virus. Dandelions are a maligned and weedy life form, just as I was an anxiety-provoking, loose container of viral multitudes. The exchange between us was unsustainable and absurdly inadequate. The herbal remedy was not enough to resolve my illness, while my need to uproot and devour the entire plant did not match the sprinkle of nitrogen I offered in return. The vaguely cannibalistic cycle of care in the life cycle of a common weed points to a tendency to sentimentalize the interpersonal intimacy of mutual aid as a micropolitical strategy of survivance when abandoned by organized infrastructures of medicine and social welfare. Self-reliance and mutual aid are often insufficient for the problem at hand, while they nonetheless call attention to essential needs and model how to care for them. Neoliberalism obscures the fact that privatized innovations are extracted from our mutual efforts and resources. The intellectual property of the healthcare sector is the prize of capitalist technoscience and a prime example of this obfuscation. The common narrative of the pharmaceutical industry is that unregulated international markets compete for profits and drive innovation of life-saving treatments, while private investors take all the financial risks. They warn that without the promise of high profits, no companies will be motivated to make new medicines, and we will all suffer and die. This narrative also ignores our collective contributions on multiple levels, including maintaining a society stable enough to nurture and highly educate individuals for specialized careers in biomedicine. We collectively provide our human and more than human bodies to experimental clinical trials. We collectively reabsorb through our permeable bodies the toxic byproducts of drug manufacture, primarily across landscapes and waterways in India, China, Kenya, and Puerto Rico, where environmental racism means that Black and brown people are disproportionately harmed. Let's talk about money. We, the public, also contribute financially. Health spending in 2016 accounted for 8.6% of the global economy, of which 74% came from governments and 18.6% came from out-of-pocket spending. The majority of top pharma companies are headquartered in the US, with a handful of powerful companies based in Europe, China, and Japan. 1 out of every $3 spent on drug research in the US is publicly funded by taxpayers. Rest here on this important figure. 1/3 of pharmaceutical research and development is subsidized by US taxpayers, who then pay an additional 40% markup on average for those drugs. Meanwhile, the top 25 pharmaceutical companies enjoy an average net profit margin of 15 to 20%, versus most Fortune 500 companies that average 4 to 9%. Recall that drug companies spend more on marketing than on research and development. The narrative that the high price of prescription drugs is necessary to fund research is demonstrably false. Pharmaceuticals are among the most profitable companies on earth, and we are dependent upon them for our lives. Despite all of our public investments in the risky phase of innovation development, there are no regulations to ensure that benefits will come to global public health through equitable access and affordability. Our mutual resources are siphoned into the commodified health sector, which allots the benefits through structural bias across race, class, gender, and national citizenship. What models for survivance exist to contend with neoliberal necropolitics? Imagine if technoscience were participatory, shaped and led by a more expansive set of priorities than those of the governance and profit-oriented elite. It would be unrecognizable. The scale of macroeconomics where global biomedicine interfaces with viral contagion is another critical node. My experience with hepatitis C demonstrates the urgency of advancing generalized transparency and policy to regulate drug pricing in the interests of public health. In 2013, news came of a breakthrough medication for hepatitis C. My doctors did not alert me, but instead I heard about it through a friend who is a medical journalist when she received a press release from a pharmaceutical company. The direct-acting antivirals eliminate up to 98% of HCV infections. The daily oral medications are well tolerated and can effectively cure the previously lifelong disease within 8 to 24 weeks. The drugs inhibit viral replication, rapidly eradicating the virus from the human body. one might expect that the story would be all over the media, an innovative first, a drug that could effectively eliminate HCV in 71 million people worldwide. Absent from the headlines, the story was instead buzzing across the business and financial wires, accompanied by stock ticker symbols to entice investment. I burrowed through intellectual property and investing blogs for what negligible information I could retrieve about how patients might access the medication. Gilead Sciences was the first to bring a cure to the market, Sovaldi. It set the list price for a minimum course of treatment at an astonishing $84,000. A U.S. Senate finance report later found this price had no correspondence to patent, research, or manufacturing expenses. Instead, it was a deliberate strategy to establish a lucrative benchmark for the industry. At this unwarranted and exorbitant price, Medicaid spent over $1.3 billion in 2014 to treat fewer than 2.4% of infections. The drugs can be manufactured for less than $100 per cure. Setting a price for the cure of HCV was the golden spike that has since emboldened pharmaceutical companies to accelerate ever higher prices for life-saving treatments and cures. No transparency or protocols in drug pricing are legally mandated, and no policies exist to ensure the public benefits from its own financial investments in research, with impacts upon healthcare costs worldwide. It is a myth that markets are unregulated for capitalist competition. Legal and political policies are firmly in place to ensure the mass transfer of public wealth from governments to corporations, such as grants for research, and also to ensure unrestricted monopoly pricing through patents and laws that ban price negotiation. Pharma is allowed to determine what they vaguely call value-based list prices for drugs, meaning that a drug is priced to extract the maximum dollar its benefit is worth to customers. A life. Against the outspoken objections of medical professionals who recommend treating HCV at any stage of the disease, the cost has forced insurers to ration drugs to the sickest patients. Hardly anyone can access the successful biomedical cure for hepatitis C. Curing HCV in the sickest does not reduce their risk of liver failure and cancer, which are exceedingly expensive to treat. It also does nothing to slow spread of a contagious viral infection hastened by the opioid epidemic. Global liver associations and the WHO declared that strategic worldwide elimination of the hepatitis C virus is logistically achievable if only the medication is made affordable. I was working as a researcher in Germany when the new drugs were approved. Germany has a mixed marketplace where public or private health insurance is mandated, but private insurers can deny coverage based on pre-existing conditions. However, the Affordable Care Act was going into effect in the U.S., which would be the first time in my adult life when I could not be denied health insurance. I contacted my hepatologist in the U.S., and he explained that regardless of the new law, I would not be treated. The economic rationing of the cure was decided based on the extent of scarring in the liver, which meant that I did not qualify as sick enough. Evidence of my lifetime of disabling illness and deadly tumor markers were not the measures for the insurer's rationing guidelines. My doctor's medical advice came permeated by the neoliberal ideologies of unregulated free markets. I was told to wait patiently several more years for the profit window to pass and hope that market competition would eventually resolve accessibility before my condition worsened. I called everyone I could, patient hotlines, doctors in the US, France, Germany, and Lebanon, even drug companies. In Germany, individual insurers negotiated the price with Gilead. Only France, with its single-payer public health system, was able to negotiate a somewhat lower price and receive rebates for cases that failed. I had no access to the capital required to pay for an $84,000 treatment out of pocket, but the undeniable privileges of being educated, white, and multilingual facilitated my improbable Plan B. I would attempt to obtain a residency visa in Germany, acquire mandatory health insurance, and find a doctor who would resist the price ration to treat me. It would take years, put me in debt, keep me 5,800 miles away from family, and access was uncertain. Backup ideas included finding a way to purchase the drug in one of the countries where Gilead offers a 90% discount to public insurers. Plan B was arduous and nearly forced me out of Germany when I was rejected by all private insurances due to pre-existing conditions. In March 2015, after months of battling immigration and medical bureaucracies, I was narrowly accepted into public insurance. My doctor in Germany worried that if the insurance challenged his decision, they could demand reimbursement for the drugs and bankrupt his practice. But due to my low viral count, I was eligible for a shorter, cheaper course of treatment. Insured, and thanks to German taxpayers, I paid €20 out of pocket for 2 bottles of Gilead's drugs. Each pill was priced at more than 30 times its own weight in gold. On the 1st of May 2015, after 2 years of chasing access to the cure, I invited a few friends to be my lucky charms as I swallowed the first of the €1,000 pills with a glass of champagne. Just 4 weeks later, the virus was no longer detectable in my blood. A few days after swallowing the last pill of the brief treatment, I woke in the morning with the exotic sensation of feeling rested and refreshed. Every other morning of my life, I tried to surface from beneath a deep weight of fatigue, despite 9 to 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. The pain I had felt every day in my abdomen was gone. At 34 years old, I never knew what it was like to wake up in a healthy body without chronic viral infection, progressively destroying my liver and putting me at risk of premature death. The loneliness persists, however, as I am one among the mere 2 to 3% of people with HCV worldwide to have been treated. It is difficult for me to occupy this position of indebtedness and gratitude for the advancement of medical science to deliver such an astonishingly life-affirming possibility amidst the deliberate abuse of public resources for the pharmaceutical industry and the democratic governments that enable it to happen. There is no excuse for this immense privilege, international complexity, and persistence it took me to access the cure. It is beyond survivor's guilt. Policies to change patent law and drug pricing that favor public participation in the commons are essential measures needed for a paradigm shift away from neoliberal politics. The virus is a vector that traces us into this critical node where sociality itself is at stake. The narratives we construct to identify obstacles and survivance beyond this pandemic must foreground the abundance of resources and biomedical expertise we collectively possess, and reject the narrative that biomedical innovation is only possible when the structures of predatory pharmaceutical profiteering and health disparities are maintained. We must name as our own commons what neoliberal biopolitics dispossess from the public, and we must be specific about it. My bloodstream has been emptied of one of its viral others, yet this porous relationality of being multiple in the world remains. Our vulnerable bodies are reliant upon each other at the planetary scale, requiring both the intimate care of mutual aid and the cures of biomedical science. To live among viruses and survive our interactions with them, think like a virus, xenophilic, opportunistic, multiplied, and many. Our resistance to neoliberal isolation must become so expansive as to saturate the atmosphere. Thank you for listening.